Hello students, welcome back to your English C1000 course. Today I'm going to discuss with you something very important. First of all, this is your required text for the course. It's entitled, They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing by Gerald, Graff, and Kathy Birkenstein. It's on your syllabus. I adopted it as a course material, but for some reason, I have not seen it show up in the course listing yet. So make sure you purchase this book. It is the 6th edition. And today we're going to take a look at one of the reading samples. This one is authored by Gerald Graff, the author of the book. And it is entitled Hidden Intellectualism. I've attached a PDF of this chapter for you right here. And this is your discussion topic. So here is the PDF. Your job is to reply to this chapter by summarizing the author's main points. And let's move this over just a little bit. There we go. And then I want you to add to the conversation 2 areas that you think could be considered hidden intellectualism. And you'll see what is meant by that as we go through the chapter. You also need to reply to 2 other people's discussions. So you have a response and 2 replies that are due by the end of the week, by Sunday. So on page 309, which is the first page of this chapter, Graff begins by saying, everyone knows some young person who is impressively street smart but does poorly in school. And he is questioning this tendency and wondering about why we consider them to be not academically oriented. The thesis of this chapter is that schools are missing an opportunity to engage students through conversations about sports or other topics that already have a thriving ecosystem of analysis and argumentation. If you turn on any sports programming that looks at the day's sporting events, you're going to see all kinds of arguments made, analysis of the events, things that we do associate with academic culture, but they're talking about topics we usually don't discuss in academia, and Graff sees this as a big mistake. He says, one of the major reasons why schools and colleges overlook the intellectual potential of street smarts is the fact that we associate those street smarts with anti-intellectual concerns. We associate the educated life, the life of the mind, too narrowly and exclusively with subjects and texts that we consider inherently weighty and academic. So he is suggesting that one of the problems that we have is not that we are missing the boat on these topics, but that we actually consider them to be anti-intellectual. And so we are at odds with the topics themselves. On the next page, he continues, he says, says the trouble with this assumption is that no necessary connection has ever been established between any text or subject and the educational depth and weight of the discussion it can generate. So he's saying it's not the subject, it's the way that we deal with the subject. He says that's why a George Orwell writing on the cultural meaning of penny postcards is infinitely more substantial than the cogitations of many professors on Shakespeare or globalization. Again, it's not the student, but the treatment of the subject that matters most. He continues, students do need to read models of intellectually challenging writing, and Orwell is a great one, if they are to become intellectuals themselves. But they would be more prone to take on intellectual identities if we encourage them to do so at first on subjects that interest them rather than ones that interest us. Us, not us. So he's saying it isn't enough to just discuss interesting topics like sports or music or fashion. It needs to be done so in a way that is intellectually challenging, and in order to learn how to write in intellectually challenging ways, we do need to study the writing of great writers, but it isn't the subject of the writing that matters as much as the way the writer thinks about the subject. At the bottom of this page, he writes about his own experience when he was a youth and he valued sports over academia. He says, I have recently come to think, however, that my preference for sports over schoolwork was not anti-intellectualism so much as intellectualism by other means. Hence the title, Hidden Intellectualism. And he discusses his experience of growing up in Chicago. And he continues, I grew up torn then between the need to prove I was smart and the fear of a beating if I proved it too well, between the need not to jeopardize my respectable future and the need to impress the hoods. So he discusses kids from neighboring neighborhoods or the tougher kids who played sports as being part of his audience, and that he was negotiating these two worlds. On the one hand, he wanted to be considered smart because that meant that he might have a future career, but he also wanted to be tough because in the neighborhood he had to travel through, he would get beat up if he appeared to be too smart. Then he has this funny aside where he mentions that Marilyn Monroe married the playwright Arthur Miller in 1956 after divorcing the retired baseball star Joe DiMaggio. He says this was the symbolic triumph of geek over jock and suggested the way the wind was blowing. What happened there? Oops. Get back into this in just 1 second. Okay, so he continues. That the seemingly Philistine debates about which boys were the toughest and the interminable analysis of sports teams were actually giving him the framework he would use as an academic. He continues, I began to learn the rudiments of the intellectual life, how to make an argument, which how to weigh different kinds of evidence, to move between particulars and generalizations, summarize the views of others, and enter a conversation about ideas. So although it was sports he was discussing, he was making these intellectual moves, which are part and parcel of academic life. He continues, I experienced what it felt like to propose a generalization, restate and respond to a counter-argument, and perform other intellectualizing operations, including composing the kind of sentences I am writing now. And this is where he makes the claim that these weren't anti-intellectual activities, but they were actually more satisfying intellectual worlds. And he says, they satisfy an intellectual thirst more thoroughly than school culture, which seems pale and unreal. They also satisfy the thirst for community. And he says that when you discussed Ted Williams' 400 batting average, you could talk about that with people you had never met. Sports introduced you not only to a culture steeped in argument, but to a public argument culture that transcended the personal. He continues that, for here is another thing that never dawned on me and is still kept hidden from students with tragic results, that the real intellectual world, the one that existed in the big world beyond school, is organized very much like the world of team sports, with rival texts, rival interpretations, and evaluations of texts, rival theories on why they should be read and taught, and elaborate team competitions in which fans of writers, intellectual systems, methodologies, and isms contend against each other. So he's saying, actually, the way the academic world works is more like the way sports are debated. And that they shouldn't be seen as separate, but indeed they are related and similar. He says, in distancing themselves from anything as enjoyable and absorbing as sports, my schools missed the opportunity to capitalize on an element of drama and conflict that the intellectual world shares with sports. He sees that if they had not steered him away from that, then he could have moved more readily from one argument culture to another. However, it is not enough to simply accept other disciplines as worthy of study, but we need to look at those interests through academic eyes, he writes. That is, to think and write about cars, sports, and fashions in a reflective, analytical way, one that sees them as microcosms of what is going on in the wider culture. So that means not just to write about or think about sports for sports' sake, but to see it as an exercise in forming arguments, in analyzing a text. In that case, it would be a game like a text, and to draw larger conclusions about what the meanings of those arguments might be. So he concludes this chapter by saying, give me the student any time who writes a sharply argued, sociologically acute analysis of an issue in source over the student who writes a lifeless explication of Hamlet or Socrates' Apology. So what do you think? Do you think that he has a good point here, that there are different subjects that are not traditionally treated in academia that could be useful, or do you think that we should focus on academic subjects like literature, philosophy, history, etc.? What are some subjects that you are interested in that you think you could analyze and write about in an academic way? Go ahead, reply to the prompt and enter into the discussion by replying to 2 other students as well. And I look forward to seeing what you have to say.